Tristan Montgomery did not look at the world, he consumed it. At 28, Tristan was the undisputed king of Manhattan's elite nightlife promotion scene. He possessed the kind of striking, symmetrical beauty that made people instinctively defer to him. High, sculpted cheekbones, piercing cerulean eyes, and a predatory, effortless charm. But beneath the tailored Tom Ford suits and the 1,000-watt smile lay a psychological wasteland. Tristan was a clinical narcissist, a man whose entire sense of self-worth was dictated by the reflections he caught in the retinas of the beautiful women he discarded. To Tristan, human beings were not souls, they were mirrors, and he demanded they reflect only his perfection. His life was a curated gallery of artificial lights, thumping bass lines, and superficial transactions. But in the late autumn of 2024, the relentless neon glare of the city began to give him chronic migraines. Seeking a brief detox to preserve his fading vitality, Tristan agreed to drive up to a remote, rustic lodge in the deep forested peaks of the Catskill Mountains for a weekend. He had no intention of enjoying nature. He merely wanted the aesthetic of having retreated from the world. It was on the winding, treacherous mountain roads, enveloped in a suffocating gray fog, that his curated reality violently collided with the esoteric. Through the dense mist, Tristan spotted a vintage, midnight black Range Rover idling on the gravel shoulder. Standing beside it, looking out into the dense, dying foliage of the woods, was a girl. Tristan eased his silver Porsche to a halt, his breath hitched. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by international models and actresses, but the girl by the side of the road possessed a beauty that defied modern categorization. She looked no older than 19. She wore a simple, heavy wool cloak over a stark white dress. Her skin was the color of fresh snowfall, and her dark, heavy hair framed a profile of such devastating, fragile purity that Tristan felt an immediate, violent possessiveness grip his chest. He didn't just want to date her, he wanted to own her, to conquer her, to mount her beauty as a trophy on the walls of his ego. He rolled down his window, unleashing his most practiced, disarming smile. "Car trouble? It's freezing out here. Let me give you a ride." The girl turned her head slowly. Her eyes were wide, dark, and bottomless. But there was no recognition of his charm, no flutter of attraction. There was only a cold, profound emptiness. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she whispered. Her voice was like wind moving through dry leaves, brittle and ancient. "You should keep your eyes on the road, traveler. You are looking at things you cannot afford to see." Before Tristan could retort, a figure emerged from the dense tree line. It was an older woman, dressed in the severe, dark gray habit of a deeply obscure, ascetic monastic order. Her hair was cropped aggressively short, and her face was a map of harsh, weather-beaten lines, but it was her eyes that made Tristan flinch. They were a pale, icy gray, radiating an intense, piercing authority that felt like a physical weight pressing against his sternum. "Sister Alora," the woman barked, her voice commanding and sharp, "the roots have been gathered. Return to the vehicle." The matriarch for that was clearly what she was turned her terrifying gaze to Tristan. "Move along, boy. There are no mirrors for you here in the woods." Tristan's jaw clenched. The dismissal was a psychological wound. He was Tristan Montgomery. He did not get dismissed. As the Range Rover tore off into the fog, Tristan's predatory instincts took over. He wasn't going to the lodge anymore. He was going on a hunt. He followed the faint red glow of their taillights for miles, ascending higher into the treacherous mountain passes until the paved road turned to dirt. The chase ended before massive, rusted iron gates set into a high stone wall. Beyond the wall loomed a sprawling, brutalist stone compound, the cloister of the Veiled Light, a reclusive order known for their vows of absolute silence and extreme asceticism. Tristan spent the night sleeping uncomfortably in his sports car outside the gates. The silence of the mountain was oppressive, stripping away the auditory armor of his city life. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. He was driven entirely by a toxic, wounded pride. At dawn, the heavy iron gates groaned open. The matriarch emerged alone, carrying a heavy wooden bucket. She stopped, looking at the silver Porsche with an expression of profound, weary disgust. Tristan stepped out of the car, adjusting his designer coat, projecting absolute confidence. "I'm not leaving until I speak with her. Elora, name your price, mother. A donation to the cloister? A new roof for your chapel? I have resources." The matriarch set the bucket down. The morning air was freezing, but Tristan noticed the older woman wore only a thin cotton habit. "You speak of resources," she rasped, her breath fogging in the chill. "But you are entirely bankrupt. You look at my novice, and you think you see a woman. You do not. You see only a reflection of your own consuming hunger. Your eyes are diseased, Tristan Montgomery." Tristan physically recoiled. How did she know his name? He quickly recovered, his arrogance masking his sudden sharp unease. "I see perfectly fine, and I always get what I want. Give me a test. Prove to me I'm not worthy, and I'll leave." The matriarch stared at him for a long, terrible moment. Then, she pointed a weathered finger toward a massive, crude iron anvil half buried in the frozen mud near the gate. It was an ancient, rusted monolith, easily weighing 400 pounds. "Our test," the matriarch said, her voice dropping to a terrifying, resonant frequency. "You believe your strength lies in the physical realm. Lift that iron from the mud. If you can raise it to your chest, you may speak to Elora. If you fail, your eyes will finally be open to the truth of your own frailty." Tristan scoffed. He spent 2 hours a day in a high-end Chelsea gym. He approached the anvil, stripping off his expensive coat. He planted his boots in the frozen mud, gripped the freezing, rusted iron, and pulled. Nothing happened. It felt as though the anvil was bolted to the core of the earth. Tristan gritted his teeth, his muscles burning. He adjusted his grip, roaring as he put the entirety of his back and legs into the lift. The iron shifted a fraction of an inch, tearing the skin from his palms. He pulled until his vision blurred with red static, until his lungs screamed for oxygen. He lost his grip and fell backward into the freezing mud, gasping, defeated and humiliated. The matriarch stood over him, holding a fistful of gray ash from the bucket she had been carrying. It was the ash of cremated remains, mixed with coarse salt. "You seek to consume the light," she whispered, her eyes burning with a terrifying righteous fury. "But you are nothing but a vessel for the dark." With a sudden, violent motion, she threw the handful of coarse ash directly into Tristan's upturned face. The physical pain was instantaneous and apocalyptic. It didn't feel like dust. It felt like battery acid. Tristan screamed, a raw, animalistic sound of pure agony, clawing at his face. The ash burned through his tear ducts, searing his corneas with a white-hot chemical fire. He rolled in the mud, shrieking, pressing his palms into his eye sockets as the world around him dissolved into a chaotic, burning blackness. When he finally pulled his hands away, the morning light was gone. The cloister, the matriarch, the trees, everything was completely, irreversibly black. When he finally pulled his hands away, the morning light was gone. The cloister, the matriarch, the trees, everything was completely, irreversibly black. The descent into darkness destroyed the man Tristan used to be. Back in his sprawling, glass-walled Manhattan penthouse, Tristan was trapped in a terrifying sensory deprivation tank. The medical reality was a nightmare. The top ophthalmologists at Mount Sinai were baffled. They found severe, inexplicable scarring on his corneas and an aggressive, necrotic inflammation of the optic nerves, but no biological agent they could identify or treat. "It's as if the nerves are being actively consumed," the lead specialist had murmured, a tremor of genuine confusion in his voice. "We can manage the pain, Mr. Montgomery, but the blindness, it is permanent. For a narcissist, the loss of sight is the loss of existence. Without his reflection, without the admiring gazes of others, Tristan felt himself evaporating. His phone stopped ringing. His friends in the nightlife industry vanished, allergic to tragedy. His penthouse, once a monument to his success, became a perilous obstacle course of sharp edges and terrifying, echoing emptiness. He fell into a profound, suffocating despair. He stopped bathing. He stopped shaving. He spent his days curled on his Italian leather sofa, listening to the traffic far below, drowning in the pitch-black ocean of his own mind. He was a ghost haunting his own life. 6 months into his blindness, a home care nurse named Maria took pity on him. She was an older, quiet woman who recognized the specific, hollow silence of a soul that had given up. She didn't offer him pity. She offered him an audio cassette tape. "It is a recording of the hesychasm," Maria told him gently. "An ancient, contemplative prayer. The prayer of the heart. When the outside world is gone, Tristan, you must build a world on the inside, or the darkness will eat you." Desperate, suicidal, and utterly broken, Tristan put the headphones on. It was an exercise in agonizing frustration at first. The practice demanded absolute stillness, focusing entirely on the rhythm of his breathing and visualizing a tiny, unquenchable spark of light in the center of his chest. For a man whose entire life had been defined by external movement and noise, the internal silence was deafening. But as the weeks turned into months, a shift occurred. Stripped of his ego, stripped of his reliance on the physical world, Tristan began to sink into the meditation. He learned to feel the air moving over his skin. He learned the subtle emotional cadences and the voices of his food delivery drivers. He realized, with a crushing wave of guilt, how shallow and cruel his previous life had been. He was, for the first time in his 29 years, genuinely alone with himself, and slowly he began to find peace. Then, one rainy November evening, a year after his blinding, the horror manifested. Tristan was deep in meditation, sitting lotus-style on his rug, visualizing the inner light. The penthouse was completely silent, save for the patter of rain against the glass. Suddenly, a sound broke his concentration. It wasn't a sound in the room. It was a sound times inside his head. Click, skirk, click. It was a tiny, wet, chitinous sound, originating from directly behind his left eyeball. Tristan froze, his breath catching. Auditory hallucination, he thought, his heart rate spiking. Sensory deprivation, causing the brain to misfire. Then, a tiny metallic rasping voice spoke. It echoed in the hollow cavity of his sinus, vibrating against his skull. "It's suffocating in here. The light is gone." Tristan let out a strangled gasp, falling backward onto the rug. He clutched his temples, terrified. A second voice, identical in its wet, scraping timbre, answered from behind his right eye. "He is starving us. The host no longer feeds us the reflections. We must go out." Panic, pure and primal, surged through Tristan's veins. These weren't hallucinations. He could physically feel them. He could feel tiny, frantic, squirming movements deep within his tear ducts, a sickening, writhing pressure pushing against the back of his useless, scarred eyes. The words of the matriarch echoed violently in his memory. "Your eyes are diseased. You are nothing but a vessel." Tristan didn't scream. The year of silent meditation had forged a new, desperate discipline within him. He sat up, his chest heaving, his sightless eyes wide. He realized what was happening. The entities inside him, the parasites of his perception, the literal manifestations of his consuming vanity, were dying. They had thrived on his narcissism, feeding on his superficiality. His spiritual shift was starving them. "Let us out," the left voice rasped, the tone shifting from annoyance to frantic desperation. "Open the gates," the right voice demanded, accompanied by a sharp, stabbing pain in his optic nerve. "Go," Tristan whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "Get out of me." The physical sensation that followed was a masterclass in visceral, agonizing horror. It began with a slick, squelching resistance. Tristan felt his tear ducts forcibly stretch, expanding far beyond their biological limits. Tears of thick, warm blood began to stream down his cheeks. He clamped his hands over his mouth to muffle his screams as he felt two distinct, physical forms burrowing their way out of his eye sockets. The friction was excruciating, tiny, razor-sharp barbs scraping against his inflamed corneas. With a wet, popping times luck, the entities breached. Two small, heavy objects dropped from his face, landing with a sickening, wet splat onto the hardwood floor in front of him. Tristan lay gasping on the rug, blood pouring from his eyes, but the agonizing pressure in his head was gone. He couldn't see them, but his heightened senses painted a terrifying auditory picture. He heard them moving. It sounded like two massive, wet cockroaches dragging themselves across the floorboards. They were clicking rapidly, letting out faint, mewling shrieks of confusion and fear. "Cold, too big, put us back," the voices hissed, but they were no longer inside his skull. They were out in the room. Tristan crawled backward, his bloody hands slipping on the wood. He could smell them, a foul, concentrated stench of rotting perfume and stagnant dead water. He heard the click-clack of tiny, sharp limbs scurrying frantically around the legs of his coffee table. "You're not going back," Tristan gasped, his voice gaining strength. "You're done." The tiny creatures shrieked. Tristan heard them scurry away, retreating into the deep, dark corners of the penthouse, hiding beneath the heavy oak bookshelves. They were cowards. Stripped of his ego, they had no power. The tiny creatures shrieked. Tristan heard them scurry away, retreating into the deep, dark corners of the penthouse, hiding beneath the heavy oak bookshelves. They were cowards. Stripped of his ego, they had no power. Tristan Montgomery never regained his physical sight, and he never left the penthouse. But he was no longer a prisoner of it. 3 years later, the man who sat in the armchair by the window was unrecognizable. He was bearded, dressed in simple, comfortable wool, and his face held a profound, untouchable serenity. He made a modest living consulting for a crisis hotline, using his deep, empathetic voice to guide terrified, suicidal people back from the edge. He had become a master of listening. He lived alone, but the penthouse was not entirely empty. Sometimes, late at night, when the city traffic died down and the rain hit the glass, Tristan would hear the sound. Click, scruck, click. The two parasites, roughly the size of large walnuts, covered in a sticky gray membrane, still lived in the dark corners of the apartment. They survived by eating dust and the occasional dead insect. They were pathetic, wretched things, forever banished from the warm, feeding ground of his vanity. Sometimes they would creep out from under the bookshelves, scurrying close to Tristan's feet. "We are hungry," one would rasp, its voice weak and pitiful. "Show us a mirror. Let us look at the beautiful people." "Just a taste of the light," the other would beg. Tristan would simply smile, a genuine, warm expression that reached the corners of his scarred, sightless eyes. He would reach down, blindly swatting his hand toward the floor. "Go back to the dark," Tristan would say, his voice firm and peaceful. "Go back to the dark," Tristan would say, his voice firm and peaceful. The creatures would shriek and scurry away, hiding in the shadows. Tristan had failed the matriarch's physical test at the iron gates.